for coming out today. We are working in collaboration with our local chem club. We are the local section of the American Chemical Society, specifically the Eastern North Carolina ACS section. You've gotten emails from me already. My name is Nathan Turner. I'm the chair of the local section of ECS. We wanted to try to offer more social opportunities for us to get together, get to know one another, and continue to collaborate together as peers. And we thought a really good opportunity to do that would be trying to host an event in tandem with the local chem club of undergraduate students and graduate students and try to see who we can get out. So we appreciate you guys coming out. Like we said before, there are some refreshments here. Feel free to grab some, especially towards the end of Chris's talk. But I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Chris Halkides. He is our treasurer for Eastern North Carolina ACS, and he has been kind enough to offer some of his time to present a talk for us today on presumptive testing. So, Chris.
Thank you. I'm actually kind of a self-trained forensic chemist, but one of the issues that drew me into forensic chemistry was the problems in presumptive testing versus confirmatory testing for various substances. And so the first thing I'll do is to define those two and differentiate them. And then I'm going to talk about 4 categories of presumptive testing for seized drugs, for ingested drugs, for the presence or absence of human blood, and for some explosives such as nitroglycerin, which are nitrate esters. Now, I'm going to basically tell you the same story 4 times over. So hopefully that idea, there'll be a theme that goes through this talk, and I think it'll become obvious what that theme is. And I'm also have designed this talk to be at least portions of it accessible to non-chemists who nevertheless take an interest in forensic issues, particularly lawyers. And so that's hopefully where we're going. Now, finally, I will offer, as humbly as I can, a few suggestions for reforms in the criminal justice system, which will be kind of a quasi-summary of what we're doing. So let's jump in and talk about, well, what do we mean by presumptive tests? Presumptive tests typically are tests performed in the field. They are often color change tests, or perhaps tests that produce fluorescence or chemiluminescence. And whereas confirmatory tests are usually much more expensive, they're performed in a laboratory, and they use a much higher, more sophisticated level of equipment. Now, presumptive tests are what we call preclusive, meaning a negative result in a presumptive test rules out the presence of what you were testing. You're done at that point if you see a negative test. A confirmatory test, though, is conclusive. So if you have a positive presumptive test, that means the possibility of the substance is there. But the confirmatory test is necessary to show that, in fact, the substance truly is present. So, but having 2 layers of testing, 2 stages of testing is necessary for many kinds of forensic tests and also many kinds of clinical tests. And just to give you an example of why we have to be a little careful about this, I'll just offer this one quote: 20 to 30% of all substances initially field tested positive for a drug and subsequently submitted to this laboratory for analysis are devoid of any drugs or contain a drug different from the one indicated in the field test. So the presumptive tests, while useful, are by no means perfect. Okay, now let's be a little formal here and say, well, how are these 2 tests different in a statistical sense? So one definition of the word sensitivity, and that one that we apply to clinical and forensic tests, is that sensitivity is defined as true positives over true positive plus false negatives, where false negative means the substance is present, but we didn't see a positive result in the test. Presumptive tests are designed to maximize sensitivity. Therefore, the number of false negatives, Fn, must be as small as possible. Okay. However, specificity is defined as true negatives over true negatives plus false positives, FP in this equation. So in a confirmatory test, we try to minimize the number of false positives, FP here, okay? And it's really hard to get any single test that is A, inexpensive, B, minimizes false negatives, and C, minimizes false positives. Trying to do all of that in one test is hard. Therefore, presumptive tests tend to be inexpensive and minimize false negatives, and confirmatory tests tend to be expensive, but you don't do a lot of them, hopefully. And then you try to minimize false positives. Okay, so that's just sort of general principles. All right, so let's look at a well-known presumptive test. It's the Duquesnoy-Levine test for tetrahydrocannabinol. And so for those of you who are not chemists in the audience, all the vertices in these drawings are carbon atoms with an appropriate number of hydrogen atoms connected. Well, in the Duquesnoy-Levine test, THC, of course, is our substance being tested for, the questioned substance. And vanillin and acetaldehyde and the other substances here are the reagents that we apply in this test. If tetrahydrocannabinol is present, we create the substance shown on the bottom of the slide, which has a color to it, a kind of violet color. So let's see, I don't know if this is working or not, maybe not. Well, in any case, the second line shows you the chromophore, the color producing substance. It's the bottom line it's the bottom fluid in the test tube. The top level of the fluid we don't worry too much about. So this is a positive test. Okay, but now let's look, for example, at hexyl resorcinol. This used to be the active ingredient in Sucrets, a throat lozenge. Well, it gives a violet color also. And the two other substances I've shown on the top line here give either a pink or red color, which might be considered a positive result also. Whereas the substances on the second row, no color change for those substances. Those of you who are chemists in the audience will see that those two oxygen atoms in any substance that produces a color have a 1-3 relationship with each other. If we label the carbon for one oxygen 1, we count out on the ring 2, 3, and that's where the other oxygen is. Whereas the 1,4 substance on the extreme left and the substance right next to it has that one has a 1-2 relationship. So the 1-3 relationship is necessary to give a color, but obviously substances that are not tetrahydrocannabinol give you the color anyway. So one take-home message for this is many of these color change tests are tests for functional groups, or they're tests for classes of compounds, not tests for individual compounds. Okay, so with tetrahydrocannabinol, we see we can pretty much guess, if we know the structure of a compound, we can guess at whether it's a false positive or not. That isn't always the case. So now I'm going to talk about two real-life situations. Gail Griffin and Wendell Harvey were truckers, husband and wife trucking team, and they were carrying like munitions or something that required a certain level of a security pass. Well, I believe Wendell had a stomach issue, so he would carry a bag of sodium bicarbonate, a white powder. Well, someone decided they didn't trust these people, and they said, well, let's test this white powder, and it came up positive, I think for cocaine, and it's sodium bicarbonate, and it's just about as innocuous a substance as you can imagine. It's extremely hard to see how this could have produced a color change in the test for cocaine, the color change test, the presumptive test that at least I'm aware of. And this was not a case of there being no harm, no foul. They were put in jail for a couple months. When their truck was impounded, it was damaged. And this is more commonly the situation than not, that there is this collateral damage when these presumptive tests are positive, and then people are incarcerated in pretrial detention because of this. So let's take another example here, and I'm going to let you read some of this. I think there's a little bit on the next slide too. So this was a fellow, Brian Getchins, and he's a recovering addict, and he had some pills for irritable bowel syndrome that were blue. And two of these cops just were suspicious. And they kept trying kit after kit. And basically, they were trying kits until something came up positive. And some of them gave yellow color when the yellow wasn't a positive or a negative result in the testing, rules. And finally, they had something which was which gave them a positive result, allegedly for fentanyl. I believe, I'm doing an educated guess, I believe that the test they used was called the Marquis test, which is a pretty non-specific test. Although it does give different colors for different drugs, it also reacts with a lot of stuff. Okay, well, okay. This is the structure of fentanyl. This dicyclomine was the actual substance in the blue pill present. I've looked at dicyclomine for a while, and I don't see the chemistry of how this reacted in the, assuming it was the Marquis test, I don't see how this was a positive result. But if you read what these two police were saying, they mentioned, they say it's even turning yellow in this thing, but I mean, yellow's not an indicator, Burnett said. But I see there, how's it got this brownish thing in the bottom corner? It's talking about the plastic bag carrying the kit. Does the same thing in this one. So they're seeing maybe some brown residue. God only knows what it was. And so here, Mr. Getchins was arrested and later put, I believe, on house arrest, which kept him from his support system. Because remember, he's a recovering addict. And of course, he had to spend tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to clear himself. So again, a positive result here is not something which is innocuous in its effect on various people. And I'm just going to quickly mention, besides things like sodium bicarbonate, vitamins, flour, Krispy Kreme donut glaze, and drywall have been reported to give positive results. It's hard to know why these results were positive without more information, but they are a little bit disturbing, to say the least. Now, I'm going to turn on to a slightly change of subject to drugs in prison. And in prison drug testing, there are both tests for seized drugs and also for ingested substances, although I'll talk mostly about ingested substances for the time being. I also have to introduce some terminology, and I will briefly go through how the emit test works in a somewhat simplified form. But it's important to realize when a drug is ingested in the human body, it's rarely the case that one tests for that substance itself. One tests for metabolites of that, one or more metabolites of that. And that's an important distinction, as I think we'll see. Because the metabolites are a tricky beast. Now, this is a cartoon representation of what's called an emit test, enzyme multiplied immunoassay technique. So in my cartoon, I'm showing an enzyme, and the enzyme has been covalently joined to a drug, okay? The drug you're being tested for. And there's also an antibody or immunoglobulin, which has a binding site which recognizes the drug. So in the absence of soluble drug or drug metabolite, the enzyme gloms onto the covalently bound drug and blocks access to the enzyme's active site. It's like the Hulk or something kind of sitting there on the active site so nothing can get in. Well, if nothing can get to the enzyme's active site, no chemical reaction can take place. Now, if you can picture in your mind, suppose we introduce the presence of the drug or drug metabolite. Now the immunoglobulin would rather bind those because there's so many more of them. So it floats away. Now the enzyme's active site is open and free. It can bind the substrate. And if the enzyme binds the substrate, and this happens 1,000 or 10,000 times, a change is seen in the ultraviolet region in the spectrum. We can't visually detect ultraviolet, but machines can easily detect ultraviolet absorption. And so the absence of the presence of the analyte brings about a release of the immunoglobulin, which then produces the UV color change. Okay, that's how this assay works. And most of the drug testing for ingested substances, cocaine and morphine and things like that, most of them work on this assay principle. But if you got nothing out of this slide, don't worry. Well, for those of you who are non-chemists, I'm going to scare you with another chemistry slide here. But again, these two slides, I think you can follow along even if you don't quite catch the drift of them. Now I'm going to introduce a compound on the left called efavirenz. It's an antiviral. People who are HIV positive may take it. When you ingest efavirenz, your body first adds an oxygen atom to where the asterisk, there's a CH bond there. The body removes the hydrogen and replaces it with an oxygen and a hydrogen, as I show in the first step here. And then a second bit of metabolism happens. That oxygen becomes the connection point for this large group of atoms that I'm showing here. It's based on glucose, and what we make is called a gluconuride. You don't need to worry about the name. There's no quiz afterwards. So it's glucuronic acid attached to what was efavirenz. And the test, the emit test, detects this conjugate, this metabolized form of efavirenz. Okay, now this is a problem for a lot of reasons. For one, in this particular test, efavirenz produces a false positive for tetrahydrocannabinol. It's a little hard to see why. This is a good example where you can't see much similarity between efavirenz and THC. Nevertheless, it's a false positive for whatever reason. And this came up in the New York correction system as a problem. They were doing testing for efavirenz, and they were also doing testing for buprenorphine. Okay, buprenorphine is both something given to people on prescription, but also a drug of abuse. It's a complicated story, and I'm just simplifying it. But dextromethorphan, which is a cough suppressant, is a false positive for buprenorphine in a different emit test, different from the one that we just talked about involving efavirenz, the antiviral. So what was curious here was contrary to the instructions that were given, the Department of Corrections said, okay, if we see a positive result in this emit test for buprenorphine, we'll run the test over again. And if that's also positive, then the person who donated the sample, they'll face, sanctions of whatever kind. And in prison, that might mean loss of privileges, or might even be put in solitary confinement or what have you. Well, what do you guys think about this? Running the same test over again. Does that make a lick of sense? This is an easy question. No, it doesn't. It's contrary to what we understand is true about presumptive testing, that there are false positives. Running it over again is going to give you the same result if there was, in fact, a false positive. So, and that really wasn't actually even the only problem that came up in New York State. I think maybe I have something on the next slide about this, although okay, so Microgenics, who is the manufacturer of this, described the test as 99% accuracy. Well, what does accuracy mean? I don't know. As someone who studied this stuff, I can't tell you. I know what specificity means, and I know what sensitivity means, but accuracy is a much harder word to understand and to define in this context, and it's not very helpful. It makes a test sound really good, but of course, even just if they were trying to suggest that false positives were rare, that's factually false, because when the corrections system went back and did a retrospective on this, they found 27% of the time when there was a positive result in the emit test, and then they did confirmatory testing by a more sophisticated technique, probably gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But in any case, they did a more specific test. And 27% of the time, what they saw was a false positive. So clearly that 99.9% number really doesn't work no matter how you slice it. Okay, oops, let's see, I have a blank slide here. I guess that means I'm supposed to switch over my thinking here. And now we've, of course, talked about seized drugs and ingested drugs. So now let's talk about testing for blood. Okay, so testing for blood, the presence or absence of blood, is obviously very important forensically. But there are going to be some false positives. The first and most obvious false positive is animal blood, which is going to test in most tests, most presumptive tests. In fact, every presumptive test that I know of, animal blood will be a positive. And unless we're talking about a crime against an animal, it's clearly a false positive. Okay, but the other thing that shows up a lot, somewhat surprisingly, there's a protein in soybean root nodules called leg hemoglobin, and that's a false positive. It actually resembles a protein called myoglobin more than it resembles our protein hemoglobin in our red blood cells, but they're all cousins of each other, and that's a false positive. Some transition metal ions, iron, manganese, copper, cobalt. Iron is, I think, the most abundant element on Earth. Manganese is common in soil. Copper and cobalt. I know cobalt shows up sometimes in certain varnishes or paints. So there are false positives that one has to be aware of here. And to maybe give you a little bit more information, I have the next two slides should help us out. So in many tests, presumptive tests for blood revolve around hemoglobin. And at the center of hemoglobin is this molecule called heme, and at the center of heme is an iron atom. And the heme is what we're actually detecting in these presumptive tests for blood. And they're very good tests in the sense that if you dilute the blood 1 part in 1,000 or perhaps even 1 part in 10,000, you will still see a positive result in many of these tests. So the sensitivity is terrific. The problem is we're actually not detecting blood here. What we are detecting is peroxidase activity. And heme, or hemoglobin, we could say is a pseudoperoxidase. So it's not an enzyme by its normal function. The normal function of hemoglobin is to simply carry oxygen. It happens to have the ability to catalyze the pseudoperoxidase reaction. So let's see what that means. So a peroxidase is an enzyme, a catalyst, that can do hundreds or thousands of turnover reactions. And it takes, in this case, hydrogen peroxide, and I show a donor here. DH2 is a donor of electrons to hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide takes the electrons and becomes 2 molecules of water. The donor loses the 2 electrons and might become colored, like a blue-green color, which I'm suggesting here. Sometimes the donor is fluorescent. And in a third possibility, the donor, when you oxidize it by this peroxidase activity, gives up a photon. That's, in fact, probably the most familiar to those of us who watch crime shows. Luminol, that's chemiluminescence. When the reduced form of luminol is oxidized, it gives off a blue photon, and that's what we detect. And that's an extraordinarily sensitive test for blood, but it's not very specific. Okay, so that's true. All of the presumptive tests for blood are really tests for pseudoperoxidase activity. Okay, so let's talk about Lindy Chamberlain. Lindy Chamberlain, when you talk about Lindy Chamberlain, think about O.J. Simpson in the 90s in this country. This was, of course, Lindy Chamberlain was in Australia, but think bigger than O.J. This really kind of paralyzed the country, this case. And Lindy Chamberlain was believed to have stabbed her infant Azaria, who was 9 weeks old, for no reason that anyone could ever explain. And she was convicted, and she was released only on pure dumb luck. And if you want to ask me about that in the Q&A afterwards, feel free. But we just want to focus now on, well, what was one part of the forensic evidence against Lindy Chamberlain. And it revolved around a specific kind of, or a particular kind of test called orthotoledine. And in this test, this test should turn a blue-green color in the presence of blood. Okay, so they found a lot of spots in the Chamberlain's car and other items that the Lindy and her husband Michael had, a camera case or something, and they found orthotoledine positive spots. So they saw this characteristic blue-green reaction. Now, there are some problems though with this. The first problem is that they actually tested parts of the car that should have been inaccessible to blood spatter, assuming that Lindy did this awful crime to her baby. And but the spots were inaccessible, yet the spots still gave this characteristic blue-green color. Now we could invoke the concept of a substrate control. They were doing a substrate control and not realizing it when they did this. But the blue-green color was there, and even despite what the prosecution said, the blue-green color is the same whether it's blood or a false positive. And peroxidase can be found in small amounts in milk. The enzyme peroxidase can be found in large amounts in things like turnips and horseradishes. But there's something else that I think is causing the false positive in this case. And that is the Chamberlains came from a town called Mount Isa, and this was a copper mining region in us. And copper dust was in the air. And if memory serves me, other cars tested positive. So maybe there was this orgy of baby killing in Mount Isa, or maybe not. And maybe it was just the copper dust that caused these reactions. Now I think everybody acknowledges this was a wrongful conviction. And the sad truth was that a wild dingo came and took their baby. But it took a long time. It took many years for her to be fully exonerated. I guess I want to kind of go maybe forward and then back here. So now let's talk about Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito. Perugia, Italy, 2007. Meredith Kircher is Amanda's roommate with two other young professional women. Meredith is found murdered. Amanda and Raffaele, her then boyfriend, helped to discover the body. So in this map of the cottage where the four young women lived, all the blue dots are luminol positive spots. And so I want to focus on spots 1, 2, and 3 for a moment. So these are spots which, when luminol was applied, gave the characteristic blue color. And you can kind of see these 3 of these images, 1, 2, and 3 here. They look kind of like feet. I'll give it that. But there's not really much more I can say about this. There's not distinguishing marks the way you could say this belongs to a certain individual. They are blue. A second test, also presumptive, but a follow-up test called tetramethylbenzidine, which gives a blue-green color also, like orthotoledine does, was tested, and these spots came up negative in the TMB test. And I cannot find any evidence that confirmatory testing for blood was done on these. I don't think confirmatory testing was done. It wouldn't be surprising if they came up negative in TMB. Why would you go on and do a confirmatory test? And yet these were brought in evidence against Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito. I don't know what caused this. Nobody knows. We can speculate. Perhaps someone traipsed around in the soil, brought in some manganese ions, and the manganese ions fused with the tile in the hallway and gave a positive result for luminol. That's as good as explanation as any other explanation that you could come up with here for this result. So, nobody knows, and I don't think anyone should. This shouldn't have ever, in my opinion, should not have been brought up at the trial because it's not an interpretable result. Again, this is the cottage. Eventually, of course, Amanda and Raffaele were exonerated, although it took, again, a number of years for that to happen. And that's a problem that we see over and over again in the criminal justice system. Even when people are exonerated, it takes a while for these wheels to grind. They grind very slowly. Let's see, how am I doing on time here? Oh, not too bad. I guess that brings us now to a subclass of explosives. Nitroglycerin and PETN are two chemically similar substances, pretty hard to tell apart, in fact, in presumptive tests. And both of them are what we call nitrate esters. And this is an older story. It comes from the 1970s in Britain. And well, let's go through the grease test first, and then I'll try to hit the highlights of the story. There's a lot of chemistry here, and so I don't want to go through the details of the chemistry, but what I want you to do is on the upper left corner, you'll see nitroglycerin. Hydrolysis of nitroglycerin releases nitrate ions with 3 oxygens, okay? If you add zinc, you turn nitrate into nitrite, nitrogen with 2 oxygens. That's all on the top line. And the original grease test detected nitrite ions, and the modified grease test detects nitrate by throwing in that zinc or cadmium to reduce nitrate to nitrite. And then eventually you get a color. And I'm showing you an image which suggests the typical color we see in a positive grease test. So the grease test is a presumptive test for some classes of explosives. Nitroglycerin gives a positive result. Trinitrotoluene actually gives a negative result for this test. You'd need another test for trinitrotoluene. But you see this characteristic pink color. Okay, so, and it's good as a presumptive test. So there were a series of crimes in the mid-1970s in Britain. They are believed to be linked to the push for Irish independence. But what they ended up doing was leading to what is now recognized as some of the larger miscarriages of justice in the history of Great Britain. So Judith Ward was convicted of the M62 bus bombing and some others. There were 2 bombings of the pubs in Guildford, and that resulted in conviction of the Guildford 4 and the Maguire 7. If you know your film history, the Guildford 4 was fictionalized in the movie In the Name of the Father. And finally, in Birmingham, there were 2 Birmingham pub bombings, and the Birmingham 6 were convicted of those crimes. They're interlocking because the same people were doing some of the testing in both, but I'm going to focus mainly on the Birmingham 6. So 21 people were killed. All right. So 6 people who were traveling from Britain to Ireland were detained. Frank Skuse was the main forensic chemist in this work. He swabbed their hands, and he then used the modified grease test and said it's positive. Now, in the Maguire 7 case, that's a little more complicated. If you want to ask me about that afterwards, I'll do the best I can with it. But with the Birmingham 6 case, I think I can give you some indication of what might have been going on here. The grease test was considered pretty strong evidence, as if it were a confirmatory test, but I have to modify that statement in a moment. But again, with the grease test, we have to be aware of certain things. If you take a deck of playing cards, and if the playing cards were coated with nitrocellulose, as playing cards used to be, and then someone swabs your hands, guess what? You're going to see a positive grease test, because nitrocellulose is going to get on your fingers, and that's going to set off the modified grease test. There are other substances like shoe polish and some other things that will also produce a false positive in the grease test. So I think that those were some of the problems that we saw in this test. And I would say there are many other things about these these cases that are quite disturbing. Lab pages were ripped out of notebooks and other problems like that. And testimony from the prosecution's forensic chemist was described as economical. So make of that what you will, I guess. But what I wanted to do was to at least mention gas chromatography, mass spectrometry in this context. Now, those of you who are chemists in the audience may imagine that gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, or its cousin, liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry, are fairly robust tests and are often part of they may be confirmatory. This was a case, though, that given the technology of the 1970s, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry gave us less information than we would have wished. The tests were only, the problem being is that the nitroglycerin would be decomposed in the gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, so all we could see was NO2 plus. We could only see plus or minus ions in a mass spectrum. In this case, they were detecting NO2 plus. Well, again, there's a problem. What was the source of the NO2 plus in the GCMS? There is at least one report that that a hand, one of the Patty Joe, gosh, I've forgotten his last name now. One of the Birmingham Six was a smoker, and smokers' hands, if you swab them, you can see something with approximately a similar retention time to nitroglycerin, and it also, for whatever reason, has an NO2 plus ion. So Patrick Joseph Hill was the person, I'm sorry, I was blanking on a moment ago. He was a smoker. So if his hands were swabbed, I could easily see how NO2 plus ions might show up. So the confirmatory test, such as it wasn't as useful as we would like it to be. And perhaps more modern testing, which is much better at not decomposing substances like nitroglycerin or PETN, they might have been better than what we had available to us in the 1970s. But in any case, these groups, all the groups I mentioned, spent roughly 15 years in prison and took multiple rounds of appeals to finally become exonerated. So this story of months or years of imprisonment followed by partial or complete exoneration seems to be one of the threads that we're seeing in all of these cases. Okay, and I guess this mostly, I think I've already talked my way through most of the information on this slide. One of the things that I did find a little odd was in what I think probably happened in the McGuire 7 case is that they also saw positive results, but I believe it is known that some of the test kits were contaminated with actual explosives. Whether those test kits were or were not used in the McGuire 7 case is impossible to determine in retrospect, but I think that's at least a possibility for why the McGuire 7 were convicted. So why do we have false positives? Well, we've seen that color change tests are often tests for classes of compounds, not for individual compounds. That's one problem. Another problem is if you do a test out in the field, you get what you get as far as lighting. And if you're trying to detect a color change, maybe you're seeing a true color and maybe you're not. Okay. Certainly, if you have police officers doing tests, I'm not criticizing police officers, but they're not trained to be chemists. And they're not trained to think, oh my God, my kit is expired. Maybe it doesn't work anymore, or things like that. So I think incomplete training, and I would also say cognitive biases, either conscious or subconscious biases of people giving the test, is not something that I would dismiss lightly as a source of problems for why do we see so many false positives in these cases. So here are my suggestions. One is obvious. Performing a presumptive test twice is not confirmatory. So that should just be out the window. I'm borrowing from Harris County, Texas, which is where Houston is. And they instituted a policy. They will not accept a guilty plea for a seized drug unless a confirmatory test has been done and come back positive. And I think that's an important idea, because if you incarcerate someone on the basis of a presumptive test, they may plead guilty just because they can't afford to spend a year or two in prison. They may have children to care for. They may have elderly adults, parents to care for. They may not be able to fight the case. And so some plead out maybe to a lesser charge or whatever. Obviously, for that reason, confirmatory testing needs to be expedited. And I would at least suggest that the fact that presumptive tests have as high a failure rate as they do, empirically, we can say they seem to be failing at 20 or 30% of the time, just on very limited sampling. That should, I think, inform the criminal justice system to say, well, maybe we shouldn't be incarcerating people pre-trial on just the basis of a presumptive test. And I would also say that if a presumptive test has been done, but a confirmatory test has not been done, based on an article I've cited here from Alan Harris, I would say that result should be excluded from the jury, that should be considered more prejudicial than probative. Okay, and now my final suggestion here is a very general one that I teach in Chem 380 here, which is forensic chemists should present the results of any test, not just these tests, but any test to the jury in the guise of an educator, not as an advocate. And the limitations of the data, the limitations of the test, its strengths, its weaknesses together should be presented by any competent ethical forensic scientist. So the forensic chemist should educate the trier of fact, not be an advocate for the prosecution or defense. All right, well, these are not all possible references that I've used, but at least they are some of the references that I've used to give us some idea of where to go for more information. And with that, I'm going to close and invite questions. Go ahead.
The company in New York that claimed a 99.6% accuracy.
Yeah.
There's nothing analogous to the FDA. There's no agency that can look at that claim. And I just tell them they can't make the claim because they lack the evidence.
That's a great question. I'm afraid I'm not certain of the answer. You would think there would be some regulatory agency that would do that. I wish I knew the answer to that, but I don't. And back. I think that's a great suggestion. I would certainly get behind that. The question was, should police be trained? And I would say, sure, why not? But of course, that's me speaking from outside the criminal justice system. But I think that would be a good reform. And go ahead. Did you have another one? I'm sorry, to have what again?
A college degree.
Oh, college degree. Oh, well, maybe so. I don't know.
Not necessarily in chemistry, but somehow a college.
Fair enough. Yes. Right. And I think if you read through some of that discussion of the one gentleman who had the stuff for irritable bowel system, those two people who were performing the test, they just sounded not ready for prime time. I mean, it was just, I was extremely unimpressed. But whether it was conscious bias or not is hard to say. Yes, here.
Yeah, there's one of you brought up a very interesting part about sensitivity. It's the word that's used in fields. versus the amount in art. Sensitivity in chemistry is the slope of response. So that needs to get ironed out somewhere because you can't have two simultaneous.
I had a very interesting discussion with a law professor about this very point, and I agree with you that the word sensitivity means one thing to an analytical chemist, but means something else in this discipline. But was there something beyond that that you wanted to?
Yeah, just accuracy. The analytical chemistry, the accuracy, they put in a certain quantity of material, they measure it, they have a certain quantity that comes up, it's accurate, and it needs some accuracy. So that's again a laboratory test, and it's saying different field, standard state for it, which should never have been allowed in this case.
Well, and just to follow up on that for a minute, one of the problems is some of these tests are purely qualitative and others are what are called semi-quantitative, which I admit is a hard word to define. But if you have a qualitative test, I don't know how to take the analytical chemistry definition of accuracy and apply it to a yes or no test. And I think the other thing this points out is if you are a defense attorney, either you have to train yourself in this lingo or you have to find an expert. And both of those are hard things to do. That's another reform I think needs to be thrown in there for the criminal justice system. Yes.
On one of your slides, you talk about
Oh yeah, I didn't. Let's see, was it this one or maybe the one before it?
It says that it's confirmatory for both the RF value between the standard and the pressure sample, as well as the expected color, either match. What's that? Or case, or did they just constant?
Oh boy, that's a good question, and I'd really need to go back carefully and read. But remember, these are now 50 years old, so the word discrepant came up in one of the descriptions, and I think discrepant meant there was a lack of matching of the RF of the question substance to the standard. I believe this was a TLC test, not though for nitrate esters. I think it was for a residue. If you make some of these substances, I think toluene was the solvent, and mono and dinitrotoluene are byproducts. And I think the TLC was a test for one or the other of those compounds. But I also remember there were other TLC tests. And in some TLC tests, you do actually try to detect nitroglycerin. So you have a little bit more information. You have the RF value, and then you spray it with a version of the grease test. But I remember reading some of the descriptions of the colors, and they talked about sort of a pale ghosty color. Whereas this test should give a robust pink. If the grease, modified grease is positive, you should get a pink color. So if you're seeing a ghosty kind of color or quasi color or whatever, that doesn't really sound like a positive result. Now, how this all got to, maybe the other part of your question is, well, how was this all discovered? It was not, for the most part, in the original trial. It gradually, after appeal, the information kind of seeped out slowly. But so I think part of the trouble here was discovery, that the defense really had one hand tied behind its back here. And it took a lot of hard sleuthing from a number of defense attorneys to turn up this evidence. And even when some of it was turned up, there was an 87 appeal for the Birmingham 6. That one failed. It wasn't until 1991 that was a subsequent appeal. That's the only one that was the one that finally succeeded. So we really need a historian here of science, or a historian of forensics, not so much me, to really get into the nitty gritty here. Yeah.
So I'm curious too. So obviously there's an issue with the evolution of chemistry being used in courtrooms in actually conveying information as an expert witness to a jury who doesn't have the same technical knowledge, who doesn't have the same. I'm wondering, is there also maybe an issue in the way that you're not training expert witnesses, obviously, but in the way that we're expecting these expert witnesses to walk into courtrooms and information not super standardized. It seems like it's not always like very clear how we're supposed to get on a standard. Like, well, this is how it works. It's fine. Just like it. I think that's a limitation for the field as well.
Here in North Carolina in the early aughts, that was a serious limitation because the training manual for the state crime lab in North Carolina referred to consultants for the defense as defense whores. And I'm not mincing words, and I'm afraid I have to use that word to convey the meaning here. And so clearly there was built into the black and white training of the scientists in the NCSBI the idea that they were that they were having to combat, bad testimony from the other side. So there's no doubt this was a problem. Ideally, we have something called, what is it called? Quality assurance in forensic science. Quality assurance should train people the way I've talked about here, to be not to be advocates, but to be educators. But clearly that training has not always been in place. What the status is in 2026, I don't feel I have the vista to say. But I agree with you that has been historically a huge problem. Yes.
It hasn't gotten much better, right, earlier. No, it hasn't, and I'm actually in a graduate course right now. The lecture I just had on expert witness testimony had a special section on defense experts. This is a doctorate level course, and it said that the instructor said he's never come across a defense expert that had anything real to say. They can say what needs to be said. Because almost everything I do is talk about the limitations of what they do. And that's all I mean, but it is offensive still.
Fascinating. Do we have any questions from the?
Not virtually.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh.
So, about a year ago, I took a tour of the North Carolina State Crime Lab. They had it open for defense attorneys. So there, Sarah Olson doing a pretty good job of trying to bridge the gap between defense bar and state crime lab. And, they're forensic experts. I've called them before, and they'll respond to me within a day. Hey, I'm working from home today. What time works for you? I can answer any questions you have. So they've been pretty, at least in my experience, open to at least having a conversation. But the prosecution, when they put on the stand, they all work for the state, they're local, or at least the ones I've seen. And the first question the prosecution is going to ask the defense expert is, you're hired, right? How much you getting paid now? And so obviously that's going to come out pretty thoroughly. But I do think the North Carolina State Crime Lab is at least open to having conversations and make themselves readily available.
Oh, that's good to know. But that does lead to another possible reform, which is to take crime labs away from the state police altogether and make them freestanding or attached to a university or something. And that would tend to take some bias away. If you're not part of law enforcement, that hopefully you'll be less biased. We have a question up there?
I was actually going to make that comment as well. That
Yes.
Perhaps there would be licenses for expert witnesses. It would not form as an expert witness unless you went through proper training. There should be ways to police it that way.
I support that, but I would say not just in this issue, but particularly in the area of arson science. The real problem I've seen is from the prosecution. The defense has generally been high in ethical standards and high in scientific standards. And well, just to give you one quick anecdote, I had been to speak one time many years ago now with a fellow from ATF. And he said he first learned arson investigation, fire science, in 1985. And every single thing he learned was wrong. So, and that if that doesn't scare you, I don't know how I could scare you, because I was shocked when I heard that, but then I realized after studying fire science for a little while as a generalist that he was absolutely correct to say that, and many people have been falsely convicted on the basis of bad arson science.
What I was just want to make a point that I was not saying just defense expert witnesses should be licensed, both sides. should be licensed.
I agree.
Who's an expert witness in a legal court.
Yeah.
Yeah, the defense person is going to be going the closed prosecution statement, prosecution case. Prosecutors saying, what are the alternatives? That's the reasonable doubt. And the prosecutor, based on their bias, is trying to say, I want this person put away, regardless of what. There's bias on both sides. So again, educate people what the bonds are. That's what the jury is supposed to do. Job of saying, facts are saying, spirit of how things are supposed to be.
Yeah.
So you're doing your job as an educator right now. Just leave it.
Well, thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
Any other questions? Oh. Finn.
It appears somebody on your Zoom may have a question.
Can you?
That was a comment from earlier.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Halkides.
We want to thank you guys for coming out and listening to our talks today. We want to make sure that we give thanks to the local section of the ECS, the North Carolina ECS, as well as the Chem Club. We are represented here to kind of give the spiel.
Hi guys, if you don't know me, my name is Christina. I am Vice President of the Club, and I just want to thank all of you guys for being here. And most importantly, I like to thank Dr. Turner and Dr. Halkides and the youth group of North Carolina Extension for putting on this wonderful presentation. And if you guys aren't a part of Chem Club and you love chemistry, please come talk to me so that you can join our journey and so that you can join us in loving chemistry together. Thank you guys again so much for coming.
Please take food. We don't want to have to deal with the later guys. This is ours. Take as much as you want. Take as much food and drink as you want. We have this room till 7, so feel free to continue.
Oh, that's good.
Stick around and chit chat.